I notice that Noam Chomsky makes some of his most important points, or points that he has adopted from others, more than once, repeatedly, sometimes even over and over. For good example, and to provide an illustration, um, you have the situation in the Ukraine, which he says NATO is willing to fight Russia down to the last Ukrainian. And he says that in 6 or 7 of his talk videos, attributes it to the person who said it first. And Joe Biden then uses those very words to deny it, to make clear that he's listening to all sides, which is perfectly admirable. So I'm not accusing you, Professor Chomsky, but perhaps this tendency to belabor a point plays into the thick headed inability of your adjuvants in the brilliance of Seattle to register even a single reality, no matter how many times it is told to them. But I'll assume the best. I'll assume that it's not that you can't get enough of it, striking down the obvious, but rather that some important points need to be said once or twice for them to sink in, for their importance to be sinking in, because people's reading habits are so atrocious. So in myself, this is my self-assessment. You know, August 14th, 22. Um, there was a story that's been documented that the South African police considered poisoning Mandela in the brain in order to humiliate him. Um, and this was put aside in favor of helping the Pittsburgh NAACP poison a white in the brain in order to humiliate him. So when you ask what do I think my potentials are, what do I think I'm doing with my speak out messages, who am I trying to reach? Do I think I'm playing old big, as they say in Pittsburgh? I have said many times that when I discovered that I had been poisoned in the brain and could see the character deformations, I used to call it, that the cruelty I'd experienced had summoned. And I heard the bizarre doctrine from the Gurdjieff left, right, that you should say the first thing that comes to your mind is that Svengali has put the curse of Weezo on you. Um, I pointed out I went into hibernation, stared into space in shock and awe, disbelief. My self assessment was that I wouldn't be entering politics. I would restrict my opinions to editorial commentary, and I would acknowledge that I have been defeated, even if it was an illicit defeat. I mean, if Nelson Mandela's brain had been poisoned and he began embarrassing people, it would have been an illicit defeat. It would have been a crime against the human rights community and against the future and dignity of this people of South Africa. And I would say that immediately. But we live on different sides of UW Dialectical's prompter. So what's wrong to do to Nelson Mandela is licky chops to do to Jimmy Quee. And I don't mean to suggest that the people who did this were necessarily all of them party to the NAACP's Yoko Ono sweepstakes in the matter of Jimmy Quee. A lot of them were like Asian, white, racist KKK people. It was a sort of formulation of select exclusion that allowed them to say it's a privilege to exclude through scientific reason, all right, who fellow traveled with liberalism. Now we will unite, and which is what they pulled. I mean, you can say what you want to about colonialization of Africa and so on, and not being the beneficiary of all that stuff. I think it's kind of a laugh. I've never lived above the poverty line. I made $9,000 a year. It's not that I wouldn't welcome income, but it's still a laugh. I mean, I'm deaf. I've not been allowed to raise a family. I've been used in a cruel and unusual experiment, and they denied that they did this. Now, suppose somebody had given Nelson Mandela a letter written in code, written all upside down in Swahili, poisoned him in the brain first. And he was all messed up when he saw it. Could you read this to me? And everybody who read it said, "Oh, it doesn't say nothing, Mandela. It don't say nothing." And then they say, "Why didn't you understand it? Why didn't you understand it?" You know, and they'll never admit that they used poison on him. That would be more like what they did to me. So my self-assessment is that I'm damaged. And when I talked to the Pope about my love for the girl that I do love, I said I'm too old for her and I'm infirmed biologically by poison torture. So I understand, I give it as a given that the answer is no. But as my poetry say, please accept that my heart is sincere, um, and that my heart goes out to you. I don't mean to trouble the muses the way that the croquet Augusta Corona has it all wired up. Carnegie Mellon University all wired up. We'll get the tiger. We'll bite him. We'll inject him. We'll kill his children and anybody in his family, anybody who he loves, anybody who he knows. We'll get. We'll do something. We'll play act that it was all from his gizmo. We know what she's doing. I mean, it's not any secret. She has the help of the penguins and shit. But as far as my self-assessment, it really doesn't have anything to do with my self-assessment. I got started talking politics stuff long before I knew any of this was going on. I was just, much less have to deal with sibling denial or anything like that. I mean, when Geiger used to hear some of the stuff that I had reported, he'd be rolling his eyes like, oh, it was obviously induced um, fallout from the mind of Trumpington impinging on the persona's experience, as Greg Carl put it. My self-assessment is like, somebody said, well, you're incapacitating yourself. You're pulling the nose off your own face, they used to say in Pennsylvania. It's a saying. Yeah, I mean, I realize that the competence level is very low and that we're in trouble with groups like Swami Nostra and the neocons and the malice of the people in the international circuit of the Green Party. And when I realize that we're in big trouble because of the weapons trade that's just demoralizing everybody constantly, the lack of commitment to educated values. I realize that my defects don't include owning weapons or hating people or stalking them or going after cultures as inferior. I try to learn and appreciate. I think appreciation is a magic word, you know. But that doesn't mean, I mean, self-respect requires me to say, I have to be uh, withdrawn from politics. I can't um, allow you to invest in my judgment because I have a brain injury. I mean, I realize my academic performance is good, but math is very hard for me. It doesn't have any hold on my mind. Some of my poetry gets jigsaw puzzled by the way that Swami Nostra operates. I mean, it's a big showdown with these horrible people from Beatles, empire of scorn for anybody who isn't them. You know, it's terrible what they're doing. But I mean, honest self respect and reflection mandates that I say, you really can't just draft me into politics. I'm certainly not Socrates. I have a brain injury. And as hard as I work to keep myself clean and fed and upkeep and alone and not bother people, you know, it's a standard that doesn't make me qualified for office. I mean, I think many people realize that it's very difficult to get an appointment even with people who are in office, the so-called normative channels of experts are often closed. You can't go to City Hall, Municipal, or the county and say, look, I have some important information that was neglected before with deleterious consequences for our Commonwealth, and have people say, whoa, show us by all means. Show us by all means. That's not what happens. They say, well, we recognize that you're a senior citizen and send you on your way, send you packing. And somebody might say, well, you have an obligation to run for office or something like that. I don't have an obligation to subject myself to the litanies of abuses of the people who could do the cruel thing to me that they decided not to do to Nelson Mandela. Now, I have said it over and over again. Nobody who would have stood for, who would have refused to stand for this if it was Nelson Mandela ever should have stood for it being done to a 12-year-old child. And yet, Louis Lapham was like, what became of the president's census? He was the cheerleader for this imbecile idea that a child of a humanist being used for a cheap cop trick should be washed out of history in favor of glorifying Holy Reagan. And, you know, how the jumping hauler got engulfed with hot wires all over creation. It's just the sadism and madcap syndicates of Brian Eno at their most loathsome. Just because I know what the Swami Nostra is and can tell people about it doesn't mean I trust myself entirely. I mean, I look for checks and balances and peer review. I think Joe Biden has done a marvelous job of trying to hold people to some semblance of sanity after all of this, you know. But to say that my awareness of what happened or something is makes me qualified to lead is comes up against my self-assessment. You know, just as you are unwilling to admit that I was poisoned in the brain, I am completely unwilling to deny it. You know, so don't darken my doors with this sublime artistry jazz that you cater to by yourself, Brian Eno. Because I've seen through it. I know you're a ragamuffin coattail rider of Michael Foucault, who was a shrewd and indecent individual who immolated himself to take a generation out. I don't admire you. Get off my case. If you don't get off my case, you know, live with the fact that I'm going to talk to the police about it because I think you're crazy. You're absolutely crazy to think that you have a right to draft me into a materialist society of the superclass for influence because it makes you feel experimental or something. My self assessment forbids me to do that. I was a part time deaf library clerk struggling. I fell in love with my girlfriend and I loved her. I had no idea that she was on a malicious enterprise for Peter Gabriel. And when I found out how dark it was, I managed to overcome my hard feelings and have isolated myself. I realize that there are people in the world who avoid errors in order to do good work. You know, they're called to being a monk, they're called to being a celibate, and all of that. It doesn't offend me, but it's not something I had ever thought to choose for myself. Though I do have to add that whenever somebody has said anything I've agreed with, it has been Pope Francis. I think people should understand that the reason is because he focuses on the meaning of moral authority. So if you're looking for someone to follow on Twitter, you know, you're welcome to follow me. But if you want a leader of some sort, I suggest you follow Pope Francis. I hope whoever succeeds him is as thoughtful of a man as he is. But I really have to say my self assessment isn't as portrayed. I don't play an old big. I don't know where that comes from. I could see its utility sometimes.